I had finished my missions, but my bombardier had been moved to another. When they put the guns in there, of course, there's no space for a bombardier anymore. So he was without a job. And I think they loaned him out to the heavies for a while. And I'm not sure why it was, but he came back to the squadron. But he was short his 50 missions. So he asked me whether I'd fly another 5 missions with him so he could come home about the same time. So we flew another 5 missions. And those missions were primarily to Admiralty Islands. I think I flew 3 missions there, and there was something. At any rate, one of the first missions there, we flew in flights, and a flight ahead of us, and I still don't remember who it was, the lead plane got hit and burst into flames and went down. I was telling myself, why the heck did I volunteer fly 5 more missions when I could have gone home with 50? But you don't think of those things too long. And I was, actually that plane I flew, there was only one hole of any size, and it was that same mission that the lead plane was shot down. The bullet, or the fragment, I guess probably, of a shell, came up through the plane, through the bombardier's seat. Well, he had been gotten off his seat, and was, because the bomb sight was forward, so he wasn't sitting in his seat when that fragment came up. But the next thing I knew, he was saying, "That damn fool shot my computer." I said, "You're damn lucky you weren't sitting there instead of your computer. It would have really gotten, I don't think he would have lived." But that's the only damage that the turret gunner was shot off in one mission. He had a cut on his forehead, but that wasn't much. I never even came close to having to make any kind of a landing other than a gear landing. There was one time, one thing I guess partly from my days in fighter school, and watching those P-38s, I'd love to drag the run and come up on my landings and come straight down instead of a normal landing pattern. And I had just made this climb when my left engine prop ran away. Something happened to the hydraulic fluid, and I actually wasn't going to be able to make the runway I intended to, because I could feel that plane slowing down to the point I didn't have enough power to overcome all the drag on that one engine. But fortunately there was another runway that went another way, and I just dropped down on that one. That's the way the fighters would do it. The fighters would they'd come in down low, and if they shot down a plane, they'd come in and they'd make one roll for each plane they shot down as they went back up. Well, I got in, at that time, if you had 50 missions in, you were eligible to return to the States for whatever you want to call it, combat relief. I think they called it, they assumed everyone who had been in battle that had to have some kind of medical examination, otherwise, I don't know, maybe we'd do something different. But, so they assigned me after, they gave me a bunch of physicals in Santa Monica. I guess there's 2 weeks there. And then assigned me to a B-25 unit to train air crews. And that's where I found out they were wanting B-26 pilots. So I volunteered to go to B-26 or A-26 pilots. And that's when I volunteered to go ahead with and train in A-26s. When I was with the A-26 training group in Florida, Marianna, Florida, I took up a flight of 3 airplanes. The fighter group was a P-51 fighter group that was close to us. And they'd call us and say, well, would you mind if we simulated attacks on your flights? And I said, sure, I'll meet you up at such and such a point at 5,000 feet. And I told the other 2 pilots that were going to fly on my wing, I said, just when I see them and they start the run, I'll put this plane in full METO power and we'll drop 500 feet to get maximum speed, which was 450 miles an hour. And we'll see what they do. Well, they never caught up with us because the P-51 didn't fly any faster than 450 miles an hour either. And that was the first bomber that ever went that fast, I think. I don't believe there was any other bomber that had that kind of speed. B-17s surely didn't, and the 24s didn't, and the B-25 doesn't. The fellow called up and he says, what are you guys flying? I said, we tried to catch you and we couldn't. I said, we were just flying normal speed. I said, what's the matter with you guys? Don't you know how to fly a fighter pattern? And at any rate, it was a kind of fun thing. When I heard about MacArthur returning, I said I wanted to get back there. So I wrote General Crabb. He was a 2-star general at the time. He'd been our commander of the group when he was a colonel, but those times you advanced pretty rapidly. And asked him to get me back there to my old unit. So he did. I got orders to come back. And when I got there, they were about ready to, my old unit was ready to change out the commander of the 499th Squadron, which I was in. And the group commander asked me whether I wanted to be squadron commander of my old squadron. Well, since I had requested an assignment from General Crabb, he had already assigned me to a group, the 3rd group, as operations officer of one of the squadrons. And he says, I'm not going to, he says, don't ask me what I want you to do or want you to do something else. I've got a job for you here, and that's it. He didn't explain it at all. But one of the big reasons he seemed eager to get me back there was that I had told him I'd been flying A-26s, and they were planning to get A-26s. So they made me squadron commander of the 8th Squadron, and we got A-26s, and that's how I finished out the war, in A-26s. Between the A-20 and A-26, I just flew another 20 missions. So weeks were in training of crews, or pilots primarily, in the A-26, so our days of helping the Army were over at that point, and they were simply getting us ready for the invasion of Japan. Although none of us knew when that was going to happen. We didn't get a lot of information of what was going on, especially intelligence information. All of us said, what's an atomic bomb? I didn't know what an atomic bomb was. You know, I was looking through an old letter that my father wrote to his classmates back in about 1908 or 1909, maybe 1910. And in that letter, he was talking about changes that he thought were going to come through. And he said, And we're an age now where we can use nuclear energy, or we will be in an age where we can use nuclear energy. Of course, he was thinking of it more in terms of some peaceful. I didn't know back then, it was like somewhere around 1910. And I didn't hear about nuclear energy going through engineering. Dad knew about relativity, and I had some vision of it, but at that point I didn't have any specific feeling of what all that meant. You know, they were girding for everything they had to throw at us. And one of the last missions we were scheduled to go on, and we knew the war was going to be over because that first bomb had been dropped. And as far as the rest of us knew, I said, even though they haven't surrendered, this war is going to end soon. And then they scheduled us to hit the Navy base at Sasebo off Kyushu. And when they had the whole group, all the squadrons came in. So all my pilots were there, air crews, and the intelligence officer started telling us what to expect. And over here were all these kinds of guns from here to here. And over on this side, the whole bay was surrounded with guns from what he was talking about. And it was surrounded by mountains, too. We were to come over the mountains, dive down into the bay to hit all the Navy ships that were accumulated there. Well, for one thing, it's bad enough to wonder about all the planes that we were going to have, which was a whole group of 60-some airplanes, all flying down. And in that case, you pick out your target within a certain area. But you know how shipping is in there, it's scattered all over. So you have the possibility of somebody looking for the same target and getting close to it. And that was the only bad thing about these multi-airplane missions, where you had a lot of planes flying in. And it's a wonder we didn't have more incidents of damage. But at any rate, it just looked terrible to have to go on a mission like that when we knew the war was going to be over. And you couldn't climb out. You had to go all the way through the bay and out through the entrance, because if you climbed out, you'd lose airspeed and you were more vulnerable to being shot down. And everything the intelligence gave us is that there were all these gun positions on the outside too. And you ought to heard the murmur that went through the crowd as we listened to that. Why do I have to go on this mission? And my gunner came up to me and he says, "I'm not going to the mission." And I said, "Well, if you can find me a gunner, fine. But you're no longer a staff sergeant. You're a buck private." And he didn't want to go. Well, I could have probably court-martialed him too, but I did get one of the other gunners volunteered to come. Because you didn't fly everybody. You had, what did I say, 9 flights, so that's just 9 planes. And you had a total of 16. I'm not sure whether we flew what number we flew that time. But at any rate, there was a spare crew around. I don't remember now for sure. And so I was able to get another gunner. Well, we were only out about an hour, maybe even less than an hour, and I got a message, return to base. Really, really happy about that. I didn't want to go on another mission, not when I knew everything was going to quit. we were stationed, and I moved into Japan when the war ended. And I was given the job of, the B-29s had demolished a lot of the buildings on Atsugi Air Base, and we were moved into the base there. So one of the jobs I had was restoring some of the barracks, mainly for the enlisted personnel. And I had one interpreter assigned to me. And the first thing I did was, there were about 200 labor forces that came from a local village. And so I divided up the group and put into 10 groups and put an officer in each one of the groups to monitor what was going on. And it wasn't particularly complicated because there was a building destroyed and there was material there, and you had to clear out all the damage that was done and then put new boards up as necessary. But communication was awkward, and I had the only interpreter. I didn't have interpreters for my officers, but what we'd do is I'd take the interpreter to each group, and he would translate what I was telling the officer I had, so that the officer knew what had to be done. One of my officers, they were pilots, mostly. I think they were all pilots. The pilots didn't have too many things to do at that time. Well, we did run surveillance missions, but that was just one plane and went out and run around. And we had 16 airplanes. So I had plenty of officers to keep busy. And once they knew what was supposed to be done, then I assumed, well, you watch it, and if anything goes wrong, I'll get the interpreter and we'll go out there and try to fix it some way. But that didn't work too well. And this one interpreter came back with a chunky violin. He was a past veteran. He was no longer in the Army, but he had been in the Army. And through the interpreter, I understand he was equivalent to a master sergeant. And he said that if I would leave everything in charge of everything to him, he'd be in charge. He said he would get the job done. So I said, what the heck? I'm not going to lose much. If he doesn't, I can go back to what I was trying to do. And if he does, none of those officers really wanted the job anyway. And so everything did improve, better communication, and I had an interpreter to really be involved in what was going on. But one day, this interpreter and this came back to me, and he said, I need you over, so-and-so, whatever his name was, I don't remember his name now, would like you to come out to a place that we've got a problem there. When I got there, this Japanese I'd put in charge was slapping this other young man back and forth. I said, hey, wait a second, what's going on? And he said, he stole some cookies from one of the airmen's barracks, because we had other barracks that were actually housing some of the people. Well, I knew that food was short in that area. In fact, there was an area of garden there that one of the people asked me about taking fruit for vegetables and everything. I told them go to it because they fertilized that with human manure. And we didn't want anything to do with their gardens. And then there was a big refrigerator that hadn't been turned on for some time, and it smelled of rotting fish. But they still went in there and took everything out. And of course, to get by the guards with anything, they had to have my permission. So every time they found something they thought they could have, well, they asked me about it, and I'd tell them the guards let them go through. Of course, with the fish, I imagine they would have let him go through anyway. But in the process, the next day, one of them stepped on a nail and it went right through those rubber shoes they had. And I know how my brother had done that once when we were little, and I knew what pain that was. So I sent him over to our dispensary, and they gave him a tetanus shot, and I told them to send him back, take him back to town and cheek. The next day I had a contingent from the village. They brought me that doll that you see sitting over there, and a couple of robes or kimonos and some other things. I can't remember now what it was. There's several little things. And they said, we want to present this to you because we were told when the Americans got there that we were going to be raped, the women would be raped, the men would be killed, and the men would get all of our valuables and take them away. And I said, we never expected to have this kind of kindness taking care of an injured laborer. So I went away with, well, I had a sword and a gun and some other things. I got several things. So when we first got there, I had been in Japan, like I said once before, and I knew the Empire Hotel was built by Wright. What's his name? Francis Lloyd Wright. And it was a prominent building. It was not hit in the bombing. And I took a couple of officers with me. We drove into Tokyo. And as we drove in, anytime we'd meet a Japanese, they'd turn their back on us. I didn't know whether that was being afraid of us or whether it was a sign of we're going to get revenge. But I got into Tokyo and we saw all this damage, but there wasn't a single American troop there. So I told the other two officers, I don't think we're going to stay here. I'm going to better go back, wait for the occupation. But the Imperial Hotel was there. And as I recall, we did go in. I don't know why I took that chance. But at any rate, it was perfectly normal. In fact, it was staffed in there. I don't remember us eating anything there, but the people were all ready to give us whatever we needed. But we went back, and the experience I had from then on was I was charged with also going out to various areas where there were potentially some type of weapons-related business going on. And each time I'd go to one of these places, the people would be working there and they wouldn't stand up, they wouldn't look at you, anything. Only the manager would come out. And in one case, he came out and I told him I was out there looking to make sure that they were not making any weapons. Incidentally, all the machinery there was made in the USA. The lathes and drill presses and all that stuff that this one building I was in, all made in the USA. At any rate, the first thing he did is called on somebody and they got some stuffed furniture out there in the yard, and where we sat in the stuffed furniture. Then he brought coffee and boiled bananas out. And another day I was out by myself, and I flew into this, saw this airfield. It was in Hokkaido. Hokkaido's a northern island. And I decided to drop in there and see what was going on. When I landed, it was on a grass strip. A Cadillac drove up. A young woman got out with a Japanese officer. And she spoke perfect English. When I talked to her, she said, well, she'd graduated from University of California. And she was the interpreter. And so she said, Major so-and-so has invited us to go to his office and have coffee, and or not tea. And so we went there, and he asked what he could do for me. And I said, I really was looking for potential wiring, because we were rewiring these buildings that we were working on. And so he called in a orderly and spoke to him about something. Go get this man something. And while I was there, I noticed he had a real pretty box. The Japanese were good at making these lilac type boxes. I'm not sure what they're made of. I just made a remark, that's a pretty box. And he said, here, take it. And I said, no. And he said, no, I insist. So I took that. And during the rest of the conversation, there was something else that I thought was unusual. And before I forgot about the possibility he wanted to give me, he said, here, take this. He was ready to give me everything, anything I wanted. Well, as it turned out, when I went back to the plane, there was this pile of electrical wiring and fittings. It wasn't new, though. And he said they had to tear it out of one of these buildings. but they loaded that into my plane in the Bombay. I think I'd had something put in the Bombay where I could load up stuff. And they were just ready to please no matter what. And in fact, back at Sugi, I had to get something, a steam line to a given building that we had the officers in that had radiators, steam radiators. And in the process of talking to me, I asked him about swords, because I knew they had family samurai swords around. And he said, I'll get you, I would give you mine, except that he talked about being in his possession a long time. But he said I had to give it up. The Army officers came around and said we had to give up any weapon we had. So I said, well, let's go over to where you gave it and I'll see if they still have it. Well, you know what happened. The officer there that was taking them in, everybody was looking for a samurai sword. And he said, of course, when I asked him about it, he said, oh, I don't know anything about it. But I knew darn well he knew something about it, because he was in charge of collecting weapons. But at any rate, this guy was ready to give me his family's samurai sword. So they were very accommodating, very pleasant. Never had any incident of anyone trying to be hostile. And actually in later years, my daughter taught Japanese there. And one of her students was part of an organization when I was working at Puritan Bennett Corporation. that was looking to have a nitrous oxide plant built in Hokkaido. And he came there with his superior and was discussing this with me and my superior, because I was in charge of that phase up here in Bennett. And it turned out he was one of the students of my daughter. He actually came out here and visited with my daughter while he was out here. So we developed a really nice friendship. In fact, he spoke English very well, and he wasn't a Shintoist, he was a Methodist Christian. And I took Ruth went along, and we went to Japan and Thailand and other places. But while we were in Japan, he arranged accommodations for me and invited us over to his home and meet his family. He had 2 daughters, and both of them were excellent pianists, and they played for us. So I had, for a long time we communicated, but I guess I don't know what happened. But at any rate, it lasted probably a good 15 years before I guess we finally decided, well, we're never going to see each other again. And we stopped communicating. He was very nice, though. And they were actually destroying some of those planes, A-26 planes and B-20. Well, not so much the A-26s, but I was told my Jayhawk, which is the name I gave my plane, was retired as battle weary. That was the term they gave it. To my knowledge, none of those planes were flown back. In fact, I think virtually all the B-25s were junked over there. You know, they actually converted some of the air, like dollar lines, for instance, they were converted to troop ships had cargo ships. And this was an Army transport. And it was in November, I guess, of 1945. Let's see, I landed in Seattle. And that was where my wife was staying. And so I went over to, they drove me over to Fort Lewis, where I was relieved from active duty, and gave me my final pay. And they were still giving your pay on bills in an envelope, bills and coins. And I think I had 3 $1,000 bills in that. You know, we got paid pretty well. We had the normal pilot's pay was somewhere in the order of $200 a month. And then you had flying pay, and then you had combat pay on top of that. By the time I came home, I think I was making about $450 a month. And that was a lot of money in those days. In fact, in those days, a lot of people were happy with $100 a month. In fact, the first job I had after I graduated from engineering was $3,000 a year. Well, I was making more money as a captain in the Army Air Corp than I made as an engineer. No, I would have gone in as a major, and I think they were not inclined to. They said they were glad to have returning pilots that were captain and below. But I wouldn't have been having combat pay, so my pay would have been lower. But I did check into flying commercial airlines. But they wanted to pay a co-pilot, which I would have had to start at, only $200 a month. Well, I didn't get much farther than that when I got my first engineering job. But as it was. I think I progressed well enough in it. Well, I stayed in the reserve. I was commissioned in the reserve, and I stayed in the reserve after the war ended. But during that period while I was going to school, they had an active reserve unit. In other words, I could go there and they had T6s that I could fly. So while I was going to school at KU, I also went out there and they named me the operations officer of the unit. We were designated in the reserve as a heavy bombardment squadron, but they didn't have any heavies for us to fly. We just flew T6s, and we had a couple of Beechcraft for training navigators. But we had some bombardiers, and I wanted to help train them also. I was in charge of the squadron. But I went over to Salina at that time that was still operating, to see if they could give us permission to practice on their range. They were very accommodating. They said, sure, anytime. I'm a little stunned sometimes about meeting people. Every time you mention that they're military, thank you for your bravery. Thank you for your duty. And I think that's an appreciation that should be given to anybody. But I think in a way it's kind of overdone, because, like I said, I never looked upon myself as being brave. I looked at this as, you know, your country's in a war. You got to be a part of it. And it's just sometimes hard to remember. It's just a waste of good people. No matter how you'd look at it. But you do have to be willing to do whatever is necessary